Somewhere on a drive that hadn't been touched in over a decade, there's a file. One file, buried in a folder of hundreds that were never opened again. Its creation date says 2011. Its last modified date says 2011. And until a few weeks ago, nothing about it had changed since. That's the whole mystery, on paper. A single file untouched for years, sitting exactly where someone left it. But the moment you actually open it, the moment you look at what's inside and when it was made and what it seems to know, the simple version of this story stops making sense. This is the story of that file, what it is, why it shouldn't exist the way it does, and why, after weeks of trying, we still can't fully explain it. Before we get into it, it's worth saying why a single file is even worth 25 minutes of your time. We think about digital information as permanent, endlessly copyable, endlessly searchable, impossible to lose the way a physical object can be lost. But most of what any of us create digitally has a much shorter functional lifespan than that. Files get abandoned constantly. Drives get wiped, reformatted, thrown in drawers, forgotten. The overwhelming majority of what's ever been saved to a hard drive will never be opened again by anyone, including the person who made it. Which means when something does survive, untouched, unopened, sitting exactly where it was left for over a decade, it's already unusual before you even know what's inside it. Most of what makes this story compelling isn't supernatural. It's the simple fact that so little digital material actually makes it this far intact, and so much can go wrong, technically and practically, along the way, that a file like this exists at all, in a readable, verifiable state, more than 10 years after it was created, is already a small anomaly in itself. Let's start with how it was found, because the discovery matters almost as much as the file itself. It came from an old external hard drive, the kind that used to sit in a desk drawer for years, forgotten until someone finally decides to clean house. The drive had been passed along secondhand, the way a lot of old hardware is, wiped in theory, but never actually wiped in practice. Most of what was on it was exactly what you'd expect. Old photos, half-finished documents, the digital equivalent of a junk drawer, and then buried 3 folders deep in a directory that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. There was one file that didn't belong, not because it was hidden, not because it was encrypted or locked or disguised as something else. It was sitting right there in plain sight with an ordinary file name. What made it stand out was simpler than that. Everything around it had a modified date scattered across a decade. 2009, 2014, 2017, 2020. The normal mess of drive that's been used on and off for years. This file had exactly one date. 2011. Created and modified within the same hour and never touched again. That by itself isn't strange. Plenty of files get made once and forgotten. What made this one different is what was inside it. Let's walk through it the way we did, methodically, the way you want if you found something like this yourself. The file opened as plain text. No formatting, no images, nothing elaborate. Just a document. A few pages long, written in a straightforward, almost clinical tone. At first glance, it read like notes, the kind of thing someone jots down for themselves, not for an audience. Observations, fragments of dates, a few names that meant nothing to us on the first read. But it was the structure that caught our attention. The notes weren't random. They were organized the way you'd organize a timeline, a sequence of events, laid out in order, each one a sentence or two moving forward in time. And near the bottom of that timeline, after a string of entries that were vague but plausible, there was one entry that referenced something that, as far as we can tell, hadn't happened yet in 2011. We're being careful with how we phrase that, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to oversell. It wasn't a lottery number or a stock price. Nothing that reads is obviously impossible. It was subtler than that. A specific detail, a specific phrasing, that lines up unusually well with something that became public knowledge years after this file was supposedly last touched. Could that be coincidence? Genuinely, yes. We want to say that clearly up front, because the rest of this video is going to sit with that tension rather than resolve it too quickly. So we went deeper. The first thing we tried to do was verify the timestamp itself. File metadata can be wrong. It can be altered deliberately or accidentally by software by transfers between systems, by the quirks of how different operating systems handle dates. So we didn't take 2011 at face value. We checked the file system structure around it, the surrounding files, the way the drive itself had been formatted, the version of the operating system it was last used with. Everything we could check lined up with a file that had, in fact, been sitting untouched since sometime in that window. Not proof beyond doubt, but nothing that immediately debunked it either. The second thing we tried was tracing the file's origin, who might have created it, and why. This is where the trail got genuinely difficult. The drive had passed through at least 2 owners before it reached us, each one adding a layer of distance between the file and any answer about who actually wrote it. We reached out to the most recent previous owner, who said, honestly, that they had no memory of the file at all, that the drive had come to them already loaded with years of accumulated data they'd never fully gone through. That's often where stories like this end. A dead end, a shrug, an unsatisfying I don't know. But we kept going, because the content of the file itself gave us something to work with. Names, fragments, references that, however vague, pointed somewhere. Cross-referencing those fragments took us into old forum archives, the kind of half-abandoned corners of the internet that somehow still exist, frozen in whatever state they were in when everyone stopped posting. And in one of those archives, we found something that made the file feel less like an isolated artifact and more like a piece of something larger. A separate post from a separate account, written in a similar clinical tone, touching on strikingly similar subject matter, posted publicly and still visible today, dated within the same general window as our file. We're not going to claim these are definitely connected. We don't have enough to say that with confidence. But the overlap was enough to make us stop treating this as a one-off curiosity and start treating it as an actual thread worth pulling. At this point, it's worth pausing to lay out the range of explanations we've considered, because a mystery like this deserves more than one theory taken seriously. The simplest explanation is also the most likely one. Statistically, coincidence, dressed up by hindsight. Humans are extraordinarily good at finding patterns in vague, ambiguous language after the fact. A file full of loosely worded notes, read years later with the benefit of knowing what actually happened in the intervening time, will almost always seem to predict something if you squint hard enough. That's not a flaw in the file. It's a well-documented feature of how human pattern recognition works, and it's the most responsible starting point for any explanation here. A second, more mundane possibility. The timestamp is simply wrong, corrupted somewhere along the file's journey between owners and systems, and the file itself was actually written much later than it claims. Old drives get reformatted, cloned, and migrated in ways that can quietly scramble metadata without anyone noticing. If that's what happened here, the entire mystery collapses into a technical footnote. A third possibility, more speculative, and one we want to flag clearly as speculative, that whoever wrote this had access to information the rest of us didn't yet have in 2011, not through anything extraordinary, but through professional or personal context that gave them an early, informed guess about where certain trends were heading. People who work closely inside a field are often better at predicting its near future than outsiders give them credit for. What looks eerie from the outside can look like informed forecasting from the inside. We spoke with someone with a background in digital forensics about the file, without revealing its full contents, to get an outside, skeptical read on the metadata question specifically. Their view, in short, was that while metadata tampering is common, the specific combination of markers we found would be unusual to fake convincingly by accident, though not impossible to fake deliberately if someone had a reason to. That's about as far as a purely technical read can take us. It narrows a range of boring explanations, without eliminating any of them entirely. There's a fourth possibility worth naming too, even though it's the hardest to take seriously and the easiest to dismiss too quickly at the same time, that the file is exactly what it appears to be, written in good faith in 2011, and the details that seem to line up with later events are simply broader and more general than they first appear, vague enough that almost any later development could be read back into them. This is, in a sense, a variation on the coincidence theory, but it's worth separating out because it shifts the responsibility from chance onto us, the people reading the file years later. We are, after all, the ones doing connecting. The file just sits there, We're the ones bringing a decade of hindsight to a handful of sentences that were never trying to predict anything in the first place. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it cuts against the instinct that makes stories like this compelling in the first place. We want a file like this to mean something. A locked room, a sealed envelope, a message from the past that turns out to matter. It's one of the oldest story shapes there is, and it's satisfying precisely because it promises that the past was paying closer attention than we realized. But that satisfaction is exactly the thing to be suspicious of. The more a piece of evidence rewards our desire for a pattern, the more carefully it deserves to be checked before we trust it. So we went back to the file a second time with that skepticism in mind and tried something different. Instead of reading it forward, start to finish, the way you'd read anything else. We read it backward, entry by entry, trying to strip away the context of already knowing how the timeline played out. Read that way. Several of the entries that had seemed unusually specific on a first pass started to look more ordinary, vaguer, the kind of thing that could describe a dozen different outcomes rather than one. But not all of them. There was still one entry, the one we mentioned earlier, that held up even under that stricter, backward reading. It didn't get vaguer the more skeptically we approached it. If anything, sitting with it longer made the specificity harder to explain away. We want to be precise about what we're claiming and what we're not. We are not claiming this file predicted anything in a meaningful sense. We are not claiming its author had access to information they shouldn't have had. What we're saying is narrower than that, and honestly, stranger for being narrower. One detail out of many resisted every explanation we tried to apply to it, including the ones we expected to work. At that point, we widened the search again, this time looking specifically for anyone connected to Drive's ownership history, who might remember more than the most recent owner did. That search led to a second contact, further back in Drive's history, who was harder to reach and, when we finally did, had a different reaction than we expected. Not recognition, exactly. More like unease at being asked about a period of time they clearly hadn't thought about in years. They couldn't confirm writing the file. They also didn't rule it out. What they did say, almost in passing, was that the time frame in question had been a genuinely strange stretch of their life for reasons entirely unrelated to any of this. The kind of vague, half-explained comment that raises more questions than answers, and that we have deliberately chosen not to speculate further about here, because it isn't ours to speculate about. That's often how these threads go. Not a confession, not a clean answer, just another layer of ordinary human context that neither confirms nor fully closes a door on the more unusual explanation. So where does that leave us? Here's what we can say with real confidence. The file exists. Its metadata is consistent with having been created and last modified in 2011, based on everything we were able to independently check. Its contents include a small number of details that line up more closely than chance alone would comfortably explain, with events that became public well after that date. And despite real effort, we have not been able to identify with certainty who wrote it or why. Here's what we can't say. We can't say this is evidence of anything beyond an unusual coincidence. We can't rule out that a piece of this puzzle, the timestamp, the authorship, the context we're missing, would fully explain everything if we had it. And we can't tell you, honestly, whether the thread we found in that old forum post is actually connected to this file, or whether it's another example of two unrelated things looking related once you're already primed to look for a pattern. That's an unsatisfying place to end a story like this. We know that, but it's the honest one, and it's better than the alternative, filling in the gaps with confident-sounding speculation just to give you a tidier ending. What we genuinely like is more eyes on this. If anything in this file's details rings a bell for you, the names, the phrasing, the timeline, we want to hear about it. Mysteries like this one are almost never solved by a single investigation working in isolation. They're solved by someone watching a video like this one, recognizing a detail nobody else had context for, and reaching out. So that's where we're leaving it. A file, sitting untouched for over a decade, that should know what it seems to know, and a trail that goes cold right at the point where it would finally start to make sense. We thought a lot, putting this video together, about why stories like this one stay with people long after the obvious explanations have been laid out on the table. Part of it, we think, is that a file is such a small, ordinary thing. It's not a strange light in the sky or a locked door in an old house. It's the most mundane object imaginable, the kind of thing sitting on every device you own right now, unopened and unremarkable. And that ordinariness is exactly what makes it unsettling when one of them turns out not to be ordinary at all. It's a reminder that the strange doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits there, quietly, waiting for someone to open the folder. We don't know if we'll ever get a full answer on this one. It's entirely possible that the most likely explanation, coincidence, dressed up by hindsight, exactly the way we described earlier, is also the correct one, and that we simply don't have enough information to prove it either way. We're comfortable saying that plainly, because we'd rather leave you an honest "we don't know" than a confident answer we can't actually back up. What we genuinely like is more eyes on this. If anything in this file's details rings a bell for you, the names, the phrasing, the timeline, even the forum post we mentioned earlier, we want to hear about it. Mysteries like this one are almost never solved by a single investigation working in isolation. They're solved by someone watching a video like this one, recognizing a detail nobody else had context for, and reaching out. So that's where we're leaving it. If you have a theory, or if you've seen something like this before, tell us in the comments below. We read every one of them, and more than once, a comment on a video like this has ended up cracking something open that we couldn't on our own. And if stories like this one are the reason you're here, stay close, because the next file we're looking into may be even harder to explain.